All right, everyone, so we're getting our heads wrapped around this thing called sociology, what it actually is. And if you remember from last time, we talked about how sociology makes a big, bold proposition, and that is that society defines who we are, that is, social context shapes who we are in this world. And so in understanding that, we're making a big claim that who we are is defined by the social context that is around us. But how could we know that this is true? This is the question sociology wants to answer, but how could we actually answer this question? So in this video, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how we can go about answering sociological questions and what kind of methods sociologists use to do that. Okay, so sociology is a social science. So in answering these questions, we're going to use the scientific method. What does it mean to use the scientific method? You might think about answering this question or a variety of different questions just in casual observations in our daily life, right? We see the world around us. Can't we know things about that? Well, sociology is about using systematic evidence to actually answer those kinds of questions. So social scientific research is all about systematically and objectively collecting and analyzing data so we can come to conclusions that can be verified by others. So we don't just haphazardly collect our data, right? We want to find ways to do this in an objective manner, to systematically collect evidence so that others around us in the scientific community can verify if we've answered this correctly or not, or if we've come to reasonable conclusions. So what are the advantages of doing this? This controls our individual biases, right? This is perhaps one of the most important advantages. All of us have biases in our beliefs about the world, and we're sort of hardwired psychologically to want to confirm those predispositions that we have, those prior beliefs that we have. We use collecting data objectively and analyzing it systematically enables us to control for those individual biases so that we're not just confirming things we think we already know to be true. It also enables us to go beyond our own small confines. It enables us to develop generalizable evidence, to look beyond specific instances or cases and be able to say, this is the general pattern that we see across individuals or perhaps across other units of society. And it enables what we can think of as self-correction. If we can have our results, the things that we claim as evidence about the world, verified by others, then if we're wrong about something, the scientific community can correct for that over time. So it has this built-in mechanism of self-correction. So let's think about ways to do this in the context of a real sociological question. Sociologists are very concerned oftentimes with poverty and questions of social mobility, who gets ahead, who falls behind in life, and what are the causes of those things. So let's take one possible question we could ask in this vein. Does growing up in poverty lead one to be poor when they are adults, right? Does the fact of growing up in poverty, of having lived your childhood experiencing poverty, does that have some kind of an effect that makes you more likely to be in poverty as an adult? So how could we go about answering this question? Well, there's actually 4 possible ways we can do this that I'm going to walk through what these methods are. These are the general methods of sociological research. And we can walk through how we might or might not be able to answer this question. And if we can't answer this question with a method, what kinds of questions about poverty and social mobility might we be able to answer with the method at hand? Well, let's start with the experiment. This is sort of like the gold standard in much of the scientific community for answering questions. In an experiment, what you're able to do is randomly assign people to different kinds of conditions so that you have an experimental group who's getting the treatment, the thing that you think is mattering here, and you have a control group that does not receive the treatment, so you can then measure whether or not the group that's getting this treatment actually ends up with a different outcome than the control group. Now, if you think about that in the context of studying poverty, how would we go about doing that, right? How would we go about studying or answering this question about the causes of poverty on adult outcomes? Well, what it would actually mean is that you have to randomly assign people into poverty, and so you can immediately see the problems here. What parent is going to be willing to randomly assign their child away from their household into another household that's potentially living in poverty. So while you might think that this experimental method does give us a great advantage, that we have complete control by us randomly putting people into different conditions, this gives us complete control to only focus on the thing that we think matters, in this case poverty. You run up to limitations fairly quickly with some questions that you might want to ask. You simply cannot ethically randomly strip babies from their parents and assign them to other families to determine whether or not they're actually the condition of poverty causes them to be poor in adulthood or not. There's a sort of serious and obvious ethical violation there. So there is a limit to what kinds of things we can study, but let's think about what questions we might actually be able to answer in about poverty with this method. Well, one thing we could plausibly do is to know how anti-poverty programs actually impact those who are living in poverty. So one of the most common things that we see in the social sciences is researchers assessing the effectiveness of an anti-poverty program. Think of something like a cash transfer program like food stamps. How effective are these in mitigating poverty? Well, you can randomly assign people living in poverty to receive food stamps or to not, or to receive perhaps a greater amount of food stamps than not, and see whether or not over the course of the next couple of years they're more likely to get out of poverty. Right? This could be one way you could answer a kind of question about poverty using the experimental method. But our core question of our core question of whether or not growing up in poverty produces this poverty in adulthood, well, we're not going to be able to answer that with the experiment. So let's think about another method we could use. One of the most common methods for sociologists is to use surveys. Surveys, we're going to design a questionnaire and we're going to administer it to some randomly selected group of people. So this has the effect of being able to just randomly pull out maybe 1,500 people from the U.S. population. And as long as we've randomly selected those people, we can administer the survey and we can make conclusions actually about the entire population of the U.S. based on this. So what might we be able to do here? Well, we could ask families at some point in time what their income level is, right? And we could define some then as in poverty and others as not in poverty. And then we could measure over time, if we're given enough time, we could then track out what happens to those kids, right? And we could ask those children when they're adults whether or not they or what their income level is, and we could then determine whether or not there's some sort of link between growing up in poverty and what your outcome is, your income level is as an adult. So the real value in doing this is that we can do this for an entire population, right? So instead of capturing 50 students at some university somewhere, we could in fact just make conclusions about the broad contours of U.S. society as a whole. So it's very generalizable in that way. It's also quite efficient. We can know lots of things about people in an effectively designed survey. You can ask lots of questions, get lots of data on people, and then be able to answer a multitude of different kinds of questions about what might cause poverty and what for people to end up living in poverty or not. And because everyone is asked the same question the exact same way, this generates comparability. We can really compare answers across surveys and know whether know what the real effect is here. Now, in some cases, you might though end up with relatively superficial data. You can't ask those really in-depth questions like, what was your experience like growing up in poverty? What was your day-to-day life like living in poverty as a child? And so in that way, you don't get as rich a set of data as you might with other methods we'll talk about in a minute. And sometimes respondents don't give you the correct answer. Perhaps an individual doesn't do a good job at estimating what their annual earnings are, for example. Or they may perhaps, in some cases, be embarrassed to divulge their low earnings, and so they inflate them a little bit. So you may not be getting, you may end up getting biased responses, I should say. So let's think about another. So that might work pretty well, a survey. Let's think about other methods we could think through here. One of the most common methods for sociologists is what's called ethnography. I mean, here I'm kind of collapsing a couple of things together, but really what ethnography is all about is firsthand observations of people in their particular social settings. So participant observation and in-depth interviews are really the most common ways that people go about doing this. So in this context, a researcher might go into a particular social setting and just observe what's happening there, right? So go into a particular neighborhood and observe interactions among people in that neighborhood. And then they might actually select out a set of people to conduct really in-depth interviews, to ask those kind of deep questions like, what is your daily experience living in poverty like, right? So this really gives us really rich and in-depth data. So we could plausibly do this with our question, but there's a lot of limitations we would come up to, right? It's very hard to gain access to these, if you imagine me as a middle-class guy going into these neighborhoods and gaining access and trust with people. And it's also really cumbersome to go into these neighborhoods and to go into enough of these neighborhoods to generalize across neighborhoods to the whole context of the U.S. like we can with the survey data that we were talking about. So what could we possibly do with these kind of methods instead? We could ask people, instead of asking what's the relationship between growing up in poverty and ending up in poverty, we could ask about their daily experiences with poverty. What kinds of barriers do they experience and face in their daily life? And to gain a sort of sense of maybe what are some of the things going on that might make it hard, even if we can't conclude in this particular context, if it is hard, what might make it hard to move up the social ladder, so to speak. And then the final method we might want to think about is what we can think of as historical or document analysis. Now in these, what the analyst does, what the sociologist does, is to do a really close reading of particular relevant documents, especially documents in their historical context. So we can study past societies, and we can especially see changes over time in societies. And if we had the right kind of data, we could look at, for example, across generations, what the link is between growing up in poverty and not, right? Or not growing up in poverty. Of course, the problem here is you can only work with the documents that you have. You can't manufacture documents from the past. You can't reverse time and create the documents you would like to have in the future, so you're sort of stuck with whatever it is that you have. But if you think about the value of this kind of work for thinking about poverty, what we can really do is understand and see changes. And this is what many sociologists have done, is to look at changes over time in how people talk about poverty and understand what it means to live in poverty, right? And you can see a movement in time and across the context from people thinking about poverty as something that is an intrinsic part, something perhaps that God ordained on top of you, into understanding things like the social barriers that create and produce poverty over time. All right, so if we're just thinking about how to conduct social research, these are the basic tools that sociologists have. We're able to use to answer different kinds of questions with each of these different methods. So we can see that some questions are better suited, as we saw in this context, for the survey. Some things are impossible with other kinds of research methods. But this is the core of the toolkit that sociologists use in answering the questions that we want to know. So this gives you a broad overview. I hope this helps you think about what kinds of questions you might want to ask and how you might go about answering those questions. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.